Okay, so I'd like to welcome you to this symposium. We're going to get started because our speakers have an actual job, and so we have to keep the tempo so that everything happens on time. So people will continue streaming in through the back doors because to date, I unfortunately haven't yet found effective method to teach the people at the front gate how to read. So we're very grateful to have you here, and it's more importantly to have so much expertise in the room. So the point of the symposium and the discussions that will take place this afternoon is to see what questions we can raise on these very important issues. We won't necessarily find answers. You might leave with more questions than answers, but that's a sign that we're confronting perspectives and going through the intellectual process of bridging perspectives to deliver a holistic analysis of a situation that unfortunately is far too close to home. So you will have a break at some point, don't worry, with coffee, etc. But for the moment, you can get your brain cells working. So I will shut up now, that's the good news, and I'll respectfully yield the floor to Admiral Christophe Lucas, who is the Deputy Director for International Relations and Strategic Affairs. He was once my student, and he is also free from me as well now, and that's why he's managed to go up the ladder.
Thank you, Emily. Your Excellencies, General, ladies and gentlemen. So I am Vice Admiral Christophe Lucas, and I am very honored to introduce the symposium held by the École de Guerre today. To speak quickly about my career in the Navy, I am a naval aviator. By the way, I have a little joke for the beginning of the speech. I don't know if you know exactly how to recognize a pilot among a lot of people in civilian clothes. Don't worry, he will tell you. So, I am a naval aviator, and I was commanding officer of a Maritime Patrol Aircraft Squadron, of a naval air station in Brittany, and of anti-submarine warfare frigate. And after being in charge of the French Naval Special Forces, men were dedicated for international relations, I held last year the position of coordinating authority for the French Navy's international relations. I am now the deputy head of the General Directorate for International Relations and Strategy at the French Ministry for Armed Forces. In this role, with my directorate with Alice Ruffo, I oversee the major part of the Ministry of the Armed Forces International Action, with our directorates in Paris and the network of defense attachés all around the world, and I also coordinate strategic foresight. On this last part, which consists of analyzing international relations, we, like you academics, have noted the major reshaping that has occurred as a result of the war in Ukraine. This war is not just a high-intensity conflict between armies. It has mobilized a colossal amount of non-military means, often unprecedented, financial and economic sanctions, food blockades, cyber attacks, energy embargoes, and so on. In doing so, this conflict has had global externalities. It has actually led to a strategic and important change, which includes massive rearmament, a tightening of strategic partnerships, and huge evolution of orientations. Just to mention the most striking ones, the evolution in the German approach on energy, and more generally, strategic supplies, and the radical change of approach of Sweden and Finland on non-alignment reflected by a NATO membership application. As a result, both NATO, through its military exercises and forward positioning, and the EU, through the adoption of continuous ambitious orientations in the strategic compass, have strengthened. At the European level, in the wake of the crisis of COVID-19, we have maintained a regime of exception and entered in a war economy, supporting in an unprecedented way the supply of weapons to a country at war, radically rethinking our strategic dependencies. In France, this has also resulted in an ambitious military programming draft bill, Loi de Programmation Militaire, LPM, with a 413 billion euros budget over the period from 2024 to the 2030. It's 100 billion euros more than the last one. This LPM takes into account a strategic context that went beyond the war in Ukraine to include its lateral dimensions, crisis of multilateralism and threats to democracy, terrorism, French overseas territories in the Indo-Pacific region, exposed to international tension, especially in the maritime domain, emergence of new forms of conflicts, etc. Our strategy for the next years will therefore be based on 4 key ideas. The first, the strengthening of our sovereignty. Second, anticipating a high-intensity context. Third, defending common spaces. And last, renewing and strengthening partnerships. As our partners and allies, we strongly support Ukraine. In this situation, I believe defense diplomacy plays a crucial role in 2 aspects with different time frames. First, ensuring Russia cannot and must not win the war in Ukraine, as our president said at the Munich Security Conference, and thus putting an end to the conflict it initiated last year. And second, rebuilding a new security architecture in Europe. It is a daily effort which requires a thorough partnership strategy and an effort of strategic convergence, which is a condition to lead to the mobilization of the armed forces and the defense industries. One of these dimensions to which I pay particular attention is the link with the academic world. Events such as this are opportunities to make French positions clearer and to better understand those of our closest partners. This is why I am hastening to give the floor to the other speakers, whose comments will allow to refine your own reflections. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Admiral, for opening this symposium, as we said, with some key questions. So maybe a beginning of answer could be given to us by Monsieur Mignot, who will pursue this reflection that you laid grounds for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear Christophe, after an admiral at the Paul Mill level, diplomat at the Milpol level, first I would like to mention that my intervention is personal and do not reflect the church's view. However, of course, my views will not be at odds with completely at odds with my boss's one, as you can guess. To begin with, I would like to commend the Rusi and the École de Guerre for organizing this seminar. I think it is really a good idea for 2 reasons. First, this seminar had to be organized in a French-British format. It takes place after a long-expected and rather successful Franco-British summit, and a few days before King Charles' visit to France. It is particularly relevant to discuss such strategic issues between French and British experts, as both countries have a large and very interesting strategic thinking and a large variety of strategic experts. And it's good to gather all these experts. And to a large extent, our 2 countries will be key actors of tomorrow's defense of the European continent simply because they might be more able and willing than others. And both countries can play a significant role inside NATO and in the EU. Second reason, this seminar is really forward-looking, and I invite speakers to remain forward-looking. Of course, this does not mean leaving aside the lessons learned from the first year of the conflict that are essential to enable us to address the conflict and the threats and challenges of tomorrow. Now, before giving some ideas, some guidance to the panels, and raising questions that you might be willing to consider, I would like to make a few remarks on the conflict. During the past decades, our armies and diplomacies have been mainly focusing on a few security issues: non-proliferation, counterterrorism, and failed states. And since the early 90s, these were the three main challenges. With Ukraine, the symmetric, large-scale state threat comes back in Europe. We knew in detail the Russian capacities, of course. The difference with this threat is that we cannot avoid being better in analyzing the intention of the adversary. The intention of a proliferating state is quite obvious. The one of a terrorist group is clear, and a failed state has no intention at all, or poor capacities. We also the dozens of armored vehicles at the borders of Ukraine in November 2001, but the intentions were not clear. In fact, they were ambiguous on purpose. We have probably not paid enough attention to Putin's speeches, to Putin's history researches, and to his long-term objectives. Our democracies are also concentrating on short-term objectives. And today for this seminar, you might consider what might be Putin's intention now. What are his objectives, stated objectives, realistic ones, what he might be able to accept at the end, what he will not be able to accept, what is Chinese president likely going to propose, or has proposed yesterday, what might be acceptable for the Ukrainians. Second idea. The battlefield is wider and more transparent. We have all seen a very large number of experts commenting the situation on the ground. People can now see what happens through private satellites, through images and videos taken by cell phones or drones. The information war is on the battlefield and more agile, better connected and more efficient, but it has also another dimension. The war is also a global battle of perceptions. The information war is not limited to the battlefield. It is spread all around the world. In South Africa, in our countries, on social networks, we cannot leave these secondary battlefields to our competitors. This means that we need to be prepared for competition in this hybrid domain. We need to be active, to maneuver before conflict occurs. This explains why President Macron has introduced last year influence as a new strategic domain. Third idea. It seems that authoritarian regimes are not so efficient as we thought they were. If our democracies might appear sometimes as slow to decide, difficult to coordinate, heavy to adapt, authoritarian regimes have really shown their weaknesses also. The absence of subsidiarity in the Russian army C2, the inability to adapt to an unexpected reality on the ground, the difficulty to contest orders when they are absurd or dangerous. In the Russian and maybe in the Chinese system, lying is probably more easy than telling to superior that you are not ready, that you are not able, that you are not equipped, and that you have kept the money for yourself. But at war, this has severe consequences. This is not only a question for military officers. This is also a civilian and sociological issue. My question would be, can we maximize this advantage? How can we benefit more from creativity, from subsidiarity, from agility, and the military domain from joint and multi-domain operations. Fourth idea, a large-scale conflict consumes very quickly a huge amount of resources. We have put tremendous pressure on our industry, but gunpowder production cannot be reinitiated overnight, we have discovered. And we are not going to produce on short notice highly sophisticated equipment on a large scale. So how could we have more plasticity in the industry, more predictability from the state's orders? How can we adjust the production at the right level of sophistication, given that mass may be required at the same time, but all this needs to remain affordable to our nations? Finally, I would like to ask a question for the first panel. In the coming years, after the war, the security of Ukraine will be key to our security. It is also the case for other states like Moldova, Western Balkans, or even Georgia. It is really difficult to imagine our security relations with Russia now, as we don't know what Russia will look like tomorrow and how much aggressive it will be. But when the war is over, how do we prevent another adventure of this type from Russia? What kind of security guarantees could be given to Ukraine? And how far are we ready to go? How much will Ukraine be able to defend itself? And what will Ukraine need from us? I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for these very insightful remarks. I note that panel one already has a question, so thank you for them. So we'll move on, therefore, to panel one, which will be moderated by Emma Butcher, who is a Senior Project Officer at Military Science at Rusi. And the speakers will be Claude Blanche-Maison, a former ambassador to Russia, Spain, and India, Martin Briens, the former head of civilian and military staff of the MOD, and Charles Litchfield, the deputy director of the Geoeconomic Center of the Atlantic Council. So, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you to the audience for being here this afternoon for our first panel, and I'd like to thank Nicole Daguerre for the invitation to chair Panel 1, Diplomacy, Alliances and World Economy. The panel's aim is to look at how the Ukraine war impacts transatlantic relations and allies, both Western and non-Western, covering ground that focuses on themes such as the impact of sanctions, multilateralism and geopolitical consequences, both current and leading into the future of the war. And to cover such important and vast topics, I am very pleased to welcome my panel, who has already been kindly introduced. In terms of structure, each of our speakers will talk for approximately 8 to 10 minutes, followed by a question and answer session, and I will be keeping very strict time. So without further hesitation, I'd like to hand you over to our first speaker, Martin Briens.
Thank you, Emma, and good afternoon. I'm happy to be back here at École de Guerre. I will focus mostly on the political aspects of the war at this point, knowing that, of course, lots of things can evolve in the next months and years. And I will make 4 brief remarks. The first one is that so far, Europe and the United States have succeeded in maintaining their unity in this crisis, and this is quite remarkable. because there could have been many opportunities for disagreements and problems. We share the same goals, and I would mention 4 of them. The first one is that we all agree on the fact that we need to support Ukraine as much and as long as necessary in order to thwart the Russian aggression through military but also financial and political support. The second goal is putting pressure on Moscow to raise the cost of the war, in particular by imposing sanctions. Third, reassuring our NATO allies. And I spent the last 2 days in Tallinn and Riga, and even now, where there is this massive support from Europe and the US to Ukraine, even now, when NATO has really taken very important decisions, the level of anxiety is still very high there. Fourth, mobilizing as much as possible the international community around those objectives. So there's a very wide and strong agreement on these 4 points. In particular, the EU has been able to remain united, and also, and which is quite extraordinary, to react very swiftly. And actually, there are things happening now which would have been deemed impossible or inconceivable 2 years, 3 years, 5 years ago. The EU is doing things today really quite remarkable. And you know, sometimes about France, we say that there are things which are possible in practice which are not in theory. But in this case, this is really what's happening with the EU. And sometimes European decision-making processes are more, you know, on a geological time scale, and this time we are more on a digital time scale. And I would mention just a couple of examples. First, we are already at the 10th package of sanctions against Russia. And actually the first one, 1 year ago, was taken in a matter of days, things which never happen usually. The second example is what was decided on Monday. You have probably seen that on Monday, the EU agreed on a scheme to supply ammunition, 155 millimeter caliber rounds, which, as you know, is a key element in the attrition war which is going on. And this did not even exist in concept a few months ago, so it came up very quickly. So anyway, of course, not all this is easy, and there are lots of things which are too slow or which are not possible, but still this is quite remarkable. Of course, we have debates from time to time, and there will probably be more debates among us. I don't know if you remember, but last spring there was a debate in the transatlantic community, especially through the media, about, you know, should our goal be a strategic defeat of Russia? Or should it be just, you know, what the Ukrainians want, and what do they want really? How far should we go? How far should they go? Etc., etc. But these debates, which are healthy, we are not the Warsaw Pact, are very still don't change in the fact that I mentioned earlier, which is we agree really on the main, elements of this strategy. My second point is that it's very clear also that we've not had the same success in mobilizing the rest of the international community. What is called sometimes the Global South, and I will comment on this a bit later. This is quite paradoxical in a way, because after all, the Russian aggression against Ukraine is a very blatant a challenge against a rules-based international order that many countries say they cherish. And also the second element is that this war has had global consequences, some, by the way, which were unexpected, such as the impact on food security. Still, and to some extent politically, we've had some successes. A resolution was adopted in the UN on February 23rd, with about 141 countries voting in favor of it, that is condemning the aggression, 7 against. It's a kind of coalition of outlaws with Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, etc. And 32 abstaining, among them some major countries such as China, India, and others. So we've had some successes, but at the same time, if we want to be very fair and realistic, it's clear that most of them, they are watching. They are what sometimes are called fence sitters, waiting to see how the situation is going to unfold. Some do it in a quite ideological manner, denouncing double standards, etc., etc. But for most of them, I suspect this is a much more opportunistic posture. They don't see what they would gain from taking side, but also some of them try to gain things from taking side as well. So it's in a way it's much more transactional. It's either passive or transactional, and that's why actually I prefer to the word the global south. I tend to call them the pragmatic south. That is really they will actually do what is in their own interest. And actually this is not so new. If you remember at the beginning of the year 2010, we had Syria, where we had really massive killings, etc. We wanted to act in the Security Council. Russia and China opposed, but actually most of the International Committee, again, didn't want to take sides really. Of course, they were, very. They had harsh words on what was going on, but they did not want to act at all. So I would say it's not new, but it's pretty clear in the present situation, and this is a challenge for us. Third point, and I'll be faster, the impact of all this on multilateralism. Well, why shall we care about this? Well, multilateralism is, in a few words, our ability to deal together collectively with the major issues of the day. I think the situation is really twofold. On one hand, all the collective security architecture is completely broken. It's broken because the UN Security Council is paralyzed, and again, it goes back to when I was in New York, so I hope I'm not responsible for it, but back in 2012-13, many treaties actually collapsed. The CFE treaty, and a few others, which were key for arms control. And you will remember that a few weeks ago, Russia announced it was suspending its participation to New START. And clearly, on security-related issues, the system is already completely broken. On the other hand, there are also many other positive elements. And you will also recall that a few weeks ago, or days even, a major treaty on the high seas was adopted by the International Committee as a whole. So that gives, I would say, a glimmer of hope. That is, on some issues, things are impossible, and probably durably. On some others, we can still manage to gather people around collective objectives. But we have to make sure that the first one is not going to poison the second one. Now, fourth point and last one, what does all this mean for the future? First, for our ability to deal with the Ukraine situation in the upcoming months. So far, we've maintained the unity of the transatlantic community, but it's not a given. Tomorrow, things can change. It can change because circumstances can change on the ground. There can be a pause in the war, there can be a debate about should there be a ceasefire or not, at what conditions, etc. One party might achieve a decisive breakthrough. Things can happen in Moscow, things can happen in Kiev, and last but not least, as we live in democracies, electoral cycles could produce, results, I would say, interesting results. We've all survived the Trump presidency, more or less, but, things can happen, and not only in the US. So, and people have this in mind. When I was in Riga and Tallinn the last 2 days, people have this in the back of their mind, that they know things can happen. So that would be a challenge. Second, Russia, over time, if the war lasts, and I suspect it will, can also have more successes in bypassing sanctions by working with other countries. I mean, I don't really enter, but we'll discuss that, the debate of whether sanctions are effective or not. But what is sure is that over time it might erode, because the Russian industrial system will adapt, because others also will work and trade with Russia. So that's an issue for the longer term. Anyway, I think in terms of convincing the rest of the world, even if we know this is not that easy, we shall not give up. The second issue for the future is how are we going to deal with other possible major contingencies? I mean, we have the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Tomorrow we might have China-Taiwan, and I think it will dwarf. I mean, the consequences of a confrontation in the Taiwan Strait, should it happen, will dwarf, as far as the global consequences are concerned, what we are witnessing now. And so our ability of dealing with it, given what we are seeing now, will probably be very limited. And of course, there are other issues. If you think about the Iranian nuclear program, this is fascinating, because in 2014, 2015, I took part to the negotiation of the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement. And at the same time, we are shouting at each other with Russia on Syria and Ukraine. The Russians were actually working very well with us, and the Americans and the Chinese and the Brits and the Germans, on the Iran nuclear issue. So they were able really to make a distinction between the two. Could we do that today? I'm not so sure. And Iran is providing weapons to Russia today. We don't know what's the quid pro quo. And when we know the importance of this nuclear issue for the security of not only the Gulf but also, more broadly, there's a huge, big question mark. Last, the impact to deal with global issues. As I mentioned, at this point, if we manage to insulate the work on these global issues from the current war, which is not easy, I think we can still try to achieve, to make progress. And actually, France will host a very important conference in June, which is called a Conference on a New Global Financial Pact. This has nothing to do, at least in the short term, with the war which is going on. But we hope, given the subject, its importance for the development and the economy of all the countries, at least we can achieve results despite the geostrategic divides. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Martin. Important questions there on unpredictability coming up. So to hand over now to Charles Litchfield to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Emma, and thank you, Martin, for kicking us off. Can people hear me? Now you can hear me much too much. So I'll have to speak quietly. Thank you. Bonjour. Odd for me, I grew up in France, to be speaking English into mainly French audience, but I will try to ignore my urge to speak French. I have just 2 points to make. The first is about sanctions and whether they're working. The second is on the transatlantic economic relationship in the wake of the beginning of this war. I'm not really a sanctions expert. At the Atlantic Council, we had one person from the US administration leave. A new person has joined us now, but I had to do the interim. The lucky thing is that I know Russia quite well, including the Russian Central Bank. So I've had a very interesting time pretending to be a sanctions expert and being among sanctions experts in Washington, D.C., who are a very curmudgeonly, grumpy bunch. They do not like it when you tell them that sanctions aren't working, but they like to tell you on their own terms why sanctions aren't working. So you cannot take that expertise away from them, or that you can't steal that role from them. And the answer is, of course, between yes and no. The question, of course, is also, what do you want from sanctions? There isn't really much of a precedent for sanctions causing a regime to change its mind or to change its calculus. I don't think anyone was particularly naive about that in the case of Russia, except perhaps in the very beginning. Some in this room will remember the sort of hubris, euphoria at the beginning of this war. It was a great achievement for the G7 to sign off on unprecedented sanctions on the Russian economy, including a block on the central bank's reserves. this was a great achievement, and I think that even the sanctions experts, with their skepticism, thought, really this, if anything is going to get the Russians to change their mind, this must be it. Well, it didn't. That being said, there are obvious signs of the sanctions having an effect on the Russian economy. The first is income from tax in the domestic economy, where activity has collapsed by more than 20%. This has been offset by high oil and gas prices, which I fear were not entirely factored in by the people devising the sanctions at the beginning. It is absolutely the right thing that Europe has done in reducing its dependency on Russian oil and gas. But this did generate an anticipation of shortages in the markets, which led to high prices getting higher, which led to Russia's income breaking records last year. Hard to see how we could have avoided this. Perhaps our exit from our dependence on Russian oil and gas could have been smoothed, but I'm not pointing any fingers. This was quite a difficult thing to get done. And what we can remember from the past year is that great things have been achieved, in the sense that 90% of what Europe would have bought from Russia this year will not be bought. And that is a great achievement. And the lights have not gone out as of yet. We've been lucky with the warm winter, but even so, I think this is a great achievement and it should be celebrated. Another element of sanctions which is discussed quite a lot is export controls, somewhat separate. I'd say it's a tool of economic statecraft. The picture is mixed here. You do see a lot of circumvention via usual suspects, Turkey, China, also in Central Asia. Their exports to Russia have jumped, sort of mechanically. In Kyrgyzstan's case, I think for supply chains, for semiconductors, it's gone up 4,000%, 3 zeros. In Turkey, obviously it's smaller, but the base is quite large. Not all of this is illegal trade, and I think it's important not to point the finger entirely at Turkey. A lot of trade has been rerouted because trains, ships that might have gone from Western Europe straight to Russia have been rerouted via Turkey. But some of that trade is illegal, at least as far as European export controls are concerned. And I think it's reassuring, heartening to see that the EU and member states are equipping themselves to deal with this. The EU now has a sanctions coordinator, Ambassador O'Sullivan, whose role is not to coordinate the process within the EU, not even really to coordinate within the G7, but to go to the countries that are used as a platform for circumvention and tell them to stop. And he has made this trip with his US counterpart and won his. This has been quite effective, but the proof will be in 2023. 2023 is the year of implementation. We have 10 packages in the EU's case. That's a bit confusing. I understand why the packages take a bit of time, and it's impressive that we've agreed on so many measures in the EU context. It's easier for the US, of course, because the economic relationship with Russia was not as intense in the first place. But 10 packages is complicated. We do see some circumvention. We do see some non-compliance within the EU. So enforcement, I think, is the challenge for this year. To bring it back to whether this is effective before moving on to what I was going to say on transatlantic economic cooperation. As Martin said, the Russian industrial system will develop alternative means of producing. This is already clear to some extent, although I do think in terms of productivity, the Russian economy will be affected for years to come. And there's no real obvious path to diversification away from oil and gas. So this is a good thing. If our sanctions regime is preventing Russia from diversifying, and it wasn't really doing a good job before the war, this is a positive result. In terms of the oil and gas, our diversification away, in combination with a price cap measure, which I'm happy to answer questions on later if you like, questions over whether it's working or not. But I think we can all agree that the revenue has been affected, and it's plunged Russia, because it's also spending a lot of money on the war effort, it's plunged Russia into a deficit, which it does not like to be in, because it doesn't really have access to international markets, and so its means to borrow domestically are finite. And despite its good or at least constructive relations with China, I don't think they really want to be dependent on Chinese lending to fund the war effort. And I don't think the Chinese really want to lend to them either. So the sanctions are somewhat effective. I think the real challenge is on preventing circumvention of export controls, which is difficult. and working on enforcement within the EU. Happy to answer any questions you may have. Second part of what I wanted to talk about was on transatlantic economic relations. I work in the US. I very much like working in the US, but I think it would be remiss of me not to criticize some US policies in the aftermath of this war. The lesson that the US wanted us all to learn from this was about resilient supply chains, trying not to make yourself dependent on untrustworthy partners. And the buzzword for this was friendshoring. There was a lot of debate in the US Treasury before Janet Yellen made the speech on friendshoring. They thought about ally shoring, nearshoring. Ally shoring is perhaps a bit too prescriptive, friendshoring is a bit too geographical, so they settled on friendshoring because it's flexible. But then in the aftermath of that speech, there hasn't really been much effort in the US to create the conditions for that friendshoring to work. The Biden administration does not believe in trade deals. This is, the context for that, the domestic political context for that is obvious. They don't want political campaigns in the Rust Belt to blame them for opening US markets and affecting US jobs. But this does mean that the Biden administration has been unable to offer more favorable market access terms, for instance, to the European Union. And in fact, it has engaged in subsidizing its own economy in a way which penalizes European Union producers. Everyone's familiar with the debate around the Inflation Reduction Act. We don't need to go into it. It's not really the topic of this panel. But I fear that there may be something of a missed opportunity in the aftermath of this war, which was that we learn our lessons from being too dependent on untrustworthy providers, but then don't, as like-minded partners, try to be that bit more flexible and that bit more imaginative on how we can supply each other. And I think this is more of a US problem than a European Union one, but I'm happy to answer questions on that, and if there are any Americans in the room, I'm happy to debate on that with you in the Q&A or afterwards. I think I'll stop there. Those are the 2 points I wanted to make, but I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Charles. And to conclude our panel, I'd like to hand you over to Claude Blanche-Besson, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Emma. I shall speak about the general framework of this conflict. And first of all, I would like to talk about the American leadership and nuclear deterrence. I think we should stress that from the very beginning of this conflict, Joe Biden declared that there will be no American troops directly involved on the Ukrainian battlefield. And he made a second statement mentioning that this conflict should be contained within Ukraine and not go over in neighboring countries or elsewhere. Those two statements are very important, of course, because they are, in fact, a consequence of the nuclear deterrence. And I must stress that this nuclear deterrence has been working up to now because there is a dialogue between Washington and Moscow at, I must say, at every level. President, Chief of Staff, ministers, Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, but also security advisors. So this permanent dialogue allows us to say that nuclear deterrence has been working up to now. It's very important because during the last year, we have heard many discussions about the so-called red line. Is there a limit of acceptability by Russia of military equipment provided to Ukraine by US or by NATO countries? This discussion are still going on, for instance, for F-16, and the American president up to now has decided that the US will not allow to provide F-16, but this red line has been moving every second month during the last year. And our Ukrainian partners usually say that this red line does not exist, in fact, and they mentioned that it did not exist for, well, each month when we were going up going with new nuclear military equipments, more sophisticated military equipment given to Ukraine. Ukraine, which pretend that this so-called red line is pure bluff from Russia, because in fact Russia doesn't want to come to war with NATO, and that's as simple as that, because they know that the Russian army could not win against NATO. To conclude with this first point, I would like to say that up to now, this military dialogue has worked, but I would like to put a very bad question, what could happen if at a certain point of the conflict, we are not there at all, but if at a certain point of the conflict, the existence of Russia was threatened, what would Vladimir Putin do? And I must say that there is no answer to this question. I was ambassador in Moscow a long time ago, but at that time it was already quite clear that Vladimir Putin is a completely uninhibited man, no rule, everything is allowed, and nobody knows what he could do at the very last limit of the situation. Some people say even at the stage if the Crimea was threatened, and of course Crimea will be threatened during the war, and of course if the existence of Russia as such would be threatened, would he dare to use forbidden armaments, nuclear but also chemical or something else? We don't know. So this threat is already there on us. My second point will be that this conflict is not, of course, World War III, but it is already a globalized war. Globalized war, and if you want to prove, just look at what has happened yesterday in Moscow with the visit of Xi Jinping, and in Kiev with the visit of the Prime Minister of Japan. I mean, both ways, those two countries have an interest in this conflict, and they feel the consequences of this conflict. First of all, with the visit of Xi Jinping in Moscow, what is interesting is that the President of China reiterated his statement that nuclear armament shall not be and could not be used, which is very important. He said to Putin, you are not allowed anyway to use nuclear threat. And I've been saying that for many months. So the same declaration, in fact, as the American president. And you can see that during the last month, neither Putin nor the Kremlin people have been agitating this threat. Some irresponsible people like Medvedev do, but I mean Medvedev is of course probably now a nobody political person. Xi Jinping has spent 3 days in Moscow, concluding of course many economical agreements with Russia, especially in oil and gas sector. But he has given also some kind of general political support to Putin. But nobody knows exactly what was the content of the 3 hours of one-to-one discussion on Ukraine, the first day. And the only outcome of this one-to-one discussion are the parallel declarations made by Putin and by Xi Jinping in front of television yesterday, in fact. And if you look at the declaration, you can see that Xi Jinping says 3 things. China wants a strict application of the Charter of the United Nations. It's a soft way to make a reference to territorial integrity because it's part of the Charter of the United Nations. and he has been saying that in the past, including 6 months ago in Samarkand on the summit of the Organization of Shanghai Cooperation, very, very precisely. Point number 2, he said that China wants to be neutral in this conflict. And third, he said that China wants to promote peace and dialogue. But finally, he made a very enigmatic declaration. He said China wants to be on the right side of history. What does that mean? And Putin was making a very great mood during this declaration. Apparently, he was a little bit surprised, because what is the right side of history? For us, there is no way. Of course, it's a victory of Ukraine. Maybe Mr. Xi Jinping has also second thought, and he thinks that that may happen. But of course, he doesn't want to see that as a complete defeat of Russia, because in his vision of the future world, in a future globalization, he needs also having a weak Russia, but a Russia, as it is today, weakened by this war, and of course, being a kind of vassal from an economic point of view, a vassal of China, which is after all the case, because all the energy deals which have been signed yesterday are unbroken prices, which is a gift given to the suzerain of Russia, which was the Chinese president. I noticed two things also, is that number 2 of the Ukrainian intelligence service a few days ago said, we have no proof that China has provided armaments to Russia, which is against many publications which have been saying after Atlantico that these and some intelligence in their Western services have some proofs of that some kind of armament has been provided to Russia. But the Ukrainian leadership prefer to say, we have no proof. And I don't know what will happen in the coming days, but normally Xi Jinping should speak with Zelensky on the phone, and we'll see what they say. Zelensky said the ideas of China for a peace plan, which is not a peace plan, but just ideas, are interesting, and I would like to discuss it with him. Of course, there is a big difference, because the Chinese are putting emphasis on ceasefire, and the Ukrainians are putting emphasis on territorial integrity. So there is apparently a contradiction between those two elements, except if you introduce other dimensions. For instance, a timetable to realize the territorial integrity, or for instance, some kind of intervention of the United Nations, not now, but at some stage when the fightings will be almost over, by the two sides being exhausted by these fights, probably sometime next year. At the same time, the Prime Minister of Japan was visiting Kiev and Bucha, and giving his full support to Volodymyr Zelensky. So, as you know, Japan is taking side with the West, including with sanctions. And it's quite clear that Japan wants to be active also in the reconstruction of Ukraine. Everybody wants to be active in the reconstruction of Ukraine. I mean, China, Japan, Turkey, everybody, because it will be a big market. It will be big money. I think we could say about the same for South Korea. We have a very similar position than Japan. And then the last Asiatic country I would mention, because I've been posted here a long time ago, is India. India is chairing during this year the G20, as you know, and there are many ministerial meetings taking place. A summit will take place end of October in Delhi. I don't know what Xi Jinping has exactly said yesterday, but I am pretty sure that Xi Jinping told Putin, you have to come to Delhi next time, because you escaped. You didn't come to Bali, the last Indonesian summit of G20. You were afraid. Now you have to come. And anyway, Delhi, India has not signed the platform of the International Tribunal, so he could probably go to India without any risk to be arrested.
But not to South Africa.
That's another story. That's another story. I doubt that the South African president would arrest Putin, but that's another story for another time. Last point is what is left for us, what is left for Europe. Well, first of all, it is obvious that this Ukraine war has resulted in an enormous strengthening of NATO. That's quite obvious, including enlargement to Finland and Sweden, which was unbelievable 2 years before, and also an enormous change in the stand of Germany. Germany has changed its foreign policy, providing a big budget to reshuffle of Bundeswehr. So Germany has also allowed to provide Leopard tanks to Ukraine. Those tanks from Germany or from other countries in Europe are on their way, and they will arrive on the battlefield probably in the coming weeks, or anyway in the coming month. And of course it could be a big change, because for the Russian army to see those Leopard tanks probably will have some non-military effect, some moral effect on the Russian army. The last question is whether Europe would be in a position to replace the US if the next American administration was more reluctant to provide massive financial and military assistance support to Ukraine. That may very well happen. We don't know. I have no answer to this question, whether Europe will be able to take over. I have some doubt, of course. I hope it would be possible, but it would be probably very difficult. And to conclude, in that case, many people will advocate for some kind of negotiation. If the negotiation is to negotiate a partition of Ukraine, I think it would be the worst outcome of the war. Why? Because partition of Ukraine will mean the prolongation of war for years. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of our speakers for your fantastic and thought-provoking talks. And I'm going to take Chair's privilege by asking the first question. Where do we see that there may be a future universal condemnation of Russia? I mean, you've talked about India. France have been active in Mali. They abstained from the first vote, recently condemned it. How far do we see universal condemnation going?
Okay, I'll try to answer.
To all other panellists.
Well, I'm next to you, so I will make a first try. Why do you want all countries in the world to condemn Russia? I mean, what is important is what they do by concrete actions. It's quite clear that countries from Asia, except some countries like Japan and South Korea, because they are in a military alliance with the US, those will of course have condemned Russia. But the other ones are against this war. They would like to see an end to this war, but they don't see why they should be aligned to the US and to NATO in a condemnation of Russia. But I would even say that if there was another way to condemn Russia without seeming to be aligned with the US and with NATO. Maybe they would do it. And maybe we have to think about it. But I think that they don't see this. And of course, they think it would bring no change in the attitude of Russia anyway. So what is the purpose? Anyway, India has formalized the concept of multi-alignment, which is a kind of modern way of saying non-alignment, and which means, which is more positive than non-alignment, which means that India has many strategic agreements, including with France, by the way, and India sees that as a possibility of having strategic cooperation with different countries, and India is taking what is interesting for India. But they can have some kind of strategic cooperation even with China, and disagree with China on that border, for instance. I mean, why not? They pretend even that the old military alliance we know in Europe is an old concept. Anyway, they don't buy it. That's my part of the answer.
Thank you. Any thoughts?
Well, actually, I agree with what you said, basically. I think this UNGA vote with the 141 exactly demonstrate that. That is, they went as far as they could because we asked them, and principles are still important issues, but doesn't mean that they would act in any way if they don't see their interest in that. So we can see clearly the kind of dichotomy between the two, and also I think it reflects the fact that today things have become very transactional, and so either it gives them something or not, and transactions mean opportunities as well, including for us. I mean, it's not only a negative thing, but it means that we have to be good and shrewd and active if we want to have countries on board, because nothing will be automatic, and worse than that, it will be probably extremely difficult, if not impossible.
Thank you.
Thanks. I've been observing the efforts to get as many people to vote with Ukraine at the UN from a distance, but from Washington. Indeed, it's taken some rather strange transactions and odd people speaking to people they don't know. I have some friends in the Estonian delegation who are looking to talk to people in the Mali delegation. I mean, all sorts of strange people who don't usually work together. Why? Because making the point about Russia's campaign in Ukraine being a colonial war has been quite effective, but it also depends on the messenger. And sadly for France, for the UK, it's been hard to propagate that message, but easier for smaller countries that have been colonized by Russia. We can disagree about what the exact verb is, but that can be that bit more effective. Mali probably wasn't the best example, given that it's pretty hard to convince them, or the regime. But it has been possible to win over some countries, and some in Washington are quite active in reminding the think tank community that they did vote with Ukraine. Brazil, Serbia being two slightly lesser known examples. They have voted with Ukraine in the resolutions. Doesn't mean that they support the sanctions, for instance, but it has been easy on the basis of how, a lot of work has gone into how the resolutions have been formulated to make the coalition as big as possible. And for now, it is pretty impressive. So I share the ambassador's view. You don't need every country, but there is still a pretty clear majority with Ukraine. And then it depends on how you count the majority. So a majority of the world's population, if you look by countries, is not participating in the sanctions coalition. But by GDP, it is still a majority. So these ways of doing the math are important as well. I think it will be hard to add more people to the sanctions coalition, so the battle is enforcement. And that does mean going to countries who are fence setters and talking to them about consequences of allowing circumvention. I've been slightly heartened by what I've seen. Turkey is a good example. It has not taken the threat of secondary sanctions, which caused some unpleasant memories, including in France. It has not taken that to get Turkey to help with compliance a little bit more. simply a threat directly from the US Treasury without any sort of specifics has worked to some extent.
Thank you. Can I open the floor to questions, if anyone has one? Yes.
Good afternoon. Commander Hans-Peter Morbach, German Cyber Information Domain Service, also here at the Colleague Air. Talking about the world competition, world economy. Currently we have two big groups here, the G7 and the BRICS group in the world, currently with a big competition amongst each other. Could there be an involvement toward a new bipolarism around these two groups, not necessarily in the current composition, but in another composition like China leading the BRICS group and some kind of EU-US lead in the G7, but with a bigger competition and a bipolarism?
The BRICS countries still need the G7 countries for investment, for their innovations. My two fellow panelists have already hinted at this. It's not because there are fence-sitting countries who don't see eye to eye with us on Russia that we cannot work with them, and it's probably a bad idea to think of the world in that way. I live in a country now in the US where the relationship with China is seen mainly in a confrontational way. And even there, if you look at the components of an iPhone, it's gone from 100% made in China down to about 90%. That may go down a bit further. Foxconn is moving some production to India, but that's to India, right, where we're not entirely aligned on this. So I think there's a lot of talk about bipolar world. I think it's a reality in a political sense in some way. I don't see it economically yet. And I'd say it's not in our interest, as I know that French diplomats are told not to employ the term the West. Is this true? But I'm allowed to. So in the West, I don't think it would be in our interest to sever ties. Because it is also a way we have leverage over the countries that don't see eye to eye with us. What's important also is that to minimize the leverage that they have over us. So this is all about finding alternative sources of supply for raw materials, for key inputs. A lot of effort is going into this. But a lot of the time, when you want to diversify away from, say, Russia or China, your options aren't entirely like-minded as well.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes?
Yeah, given the risks that you mentioned around China and Taiwan, etc., in the future, and the obvious risks of having a conflict on two fronts, I quite often wonder if the Americans really know what they're doing when they are so aggressive against things that China say and do. Have you any observation on that? I just kind of hope they know what they're doing.
Well, first, I mean, as you know, this realization that there was an enormous China challenge is not new. You know, it's from now. I mean, basically, it started probably before Obama, but Obama clearly made the decision to disentangle the US from the Middle East and the never-ending wars there, and to focus on what was seen as the major challenge, which was not only military but also in other fields. And now it has, it's also in the technology field that the competition is going on. I don't know if it's a mistake or not a mistake. It's just a reality that China, to a large extent, it's like, in a way, sometimes I compare, geopolitics to astrophysics. Massive stars they tend to bend physics around them, space and time, and China and the US, it's a bit like this. They are special because they are extremely powerful, and in the case of China, they are not happy with the world order as it is, which comes from the end of the Second World War. They didn't build it. They tend to think that it's not beneficial to them. And they want to propose another world order. So you had the Belt and Road Initiative. Now you have all kind of new acronyms, a GSI, a GCI, a GBI, whatever, the whole list, the full list. And they are trying to do this. They don't have much traction. I mean, someone mentioned the BRICS. Okay, the BRICS is a nice summit every once in a while, but there's nothing structural. I mean, they have transactional ties, they do business together, but they are not proposing an alternative world order per se. Nothing compared to the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, and so on. That's the realization that China wants to build these new rules, which I think has led to this policy. Now, I mean, it's the question is, I mean, and Graham Allison wrote his book about the two-seated trap and the fact that there can be only conflict between an emerging power and an established power. I think we have to be a bit, and that's where I think you're right on one aspect, which is you have to beware of self-fulfilling prophecy. That is, if you say there's going to be a war, there will be a war inevitably. And so a confrontation is not certain, a competition is certain. It's already going on. But it's written nowhere that it's going to end up in and we in Europe have a role to play. I mean, I don't think anybody in Europe is not any more than others willing to have this kind of confrontation. Anyway.
I think we must be careful with the parallel between Ukraine and Taiwan for two reasons. The first one is the juridical one. Second one is timetable. Well, timetable is obviously China has times, and timetable is not the same as Ukraine. And the risk of war in, a conflict with China could very well be in South China Sea much before conflict about Taiwan. Second reason is juridical. The new foreign minister of China put a very naughty question 2 or 3 days ago. He said, I don't understand why the Americans and NATO people are advocating for territorial integrity of Ukraine and not territorial integrity of China. Because from a UN point of view, so what we want with Taiwan is a status quo. But obviously, from a juridical point of view, in the UN, Taiwan is part of China, but of course with a different system, one country, two systems.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. If yes, over in the.
Thank you very much. I would like your thoughts on two things. The first one being, what if China's statement being on the right side of history doesn't really mean being on Ukraine's side? Because I understand China's strategy pushing the importance of territorial integrity and the strategy for Taiwan. But as Marxism, Leninism has been China's ideology, it's claiming that the motion of history is the collapse of the capitalist West. So just, food for thought. What if being on the right side of history means being on the side of Russia in the end? I mean, totally. And a second question, we've seen that China has recently issued a peace proposition for Ukraine. And this peace proposal prioritizes peace over territorial integrity. It's not really the position of Western democracies. And my question is, since we've been talking about unity and, so far, could there be any disagreements among EU countries, NATO countries, and some of them following this kind of mediation and peace proposal and prioritizing peace over Ukrainian territorial integrity?
Well, on the first question, it's quite easy to answer that it was intentionally flexible and open-ended. So you seem to know Marxist-Leninist doctrine quite well, which is good. China's experience of the past 40 years has not been entirely within the bounds of Marxist-Leninist theory, and I think they play with that flexibility quite often. So, as the ambassador suggested earlier, this is a very open-ended statement, more open-ended than we might have assumed. So I think that is why some have seen this as slightly encouraging. It could mean, depending on how the war evolves, that they say in the future, of course we meant we were fully behind Russia, but it could also be useful in another scenario, one which I hope most people in this room want to see happen. Can you remind us what your second question was?
The second question was about the peace proposal and divisions among EU and NATO countries.
Yes. Again, something that we're starting to see in Washington. Negotiation shouldn't be a dirty word, and I hope people don't get me wrong on this. I want Ukraine's territorial integrity to be respected, and I want Ukraine to win. All I'd say is that you'd be surprised who, when the cameras are turned off, talks about negotiations, including some of the most vocal supporters of Ukraine. I think at this point, it's not really worth entering negotiations for reasons that have already been mentioned by my fellow panelists. Who exactly are you talking to? How can you get Russia to commit to anything? If you talk about security guarantees to Ukraine, what might they be? Who enforces them? People might remember the Budapest Memorandum in this room. Wasn't really worth much. So we're in a very in a very awkward spot where it shouldn't be wrong to talk about negotiations. We should want to minimize how long this war goes on and how many lives are lost. But I think realistically at this point, we're in a position where still it's the war that dictates where things will land. And so it's right to be supporting Ukraine militarily so that they can make some more advances. But I won't hide that in private, the question of whether it is even realistic to talk about Crimea comes up, including from people who in public would say they never talk about that at all.
Just to comment on a very light touch on the right side of history saying, I remember a friend of mine, I was posted in Beijing, once he remarked, he said, you know, the Chinese, they often say, we want a win-win solution. Actually, what they mean is, I win, I win. Anyway, no, the second point, I mean, obviously, and I agree with what you said, but there's also the question of what Ukrainians want, you know, and when and how and in what political conditions. And the day something of this kind happens, they will have probably tough choices to make. So starting, you know, to speculate about this at this point can only, weaken the war effort. And at this point, we are not there yet at all. The question is clearly how to, defeat the aggression which is there. And then there is what the ambassador mentioned, that is all the consequences of accepting things de facto, facts on the ground, which all the consequences for the rest of the world. Anyway, so that's.
I think due to time we should leave it there, but I thank you so much, audience, and can you join me in thanking our panelists for a really fantastic conversation?
So please do not discard your questions. I know, like in all symposiums, it's always very frustrating because there is a time constraint. But please keep your questions because in an hour, there'll be a 30-minute coffee break, so you can ask your questions to the panelists then. And then later, there'll be a champagne cocktail, which is, at the end of the day, the sole reason why we organize symposiums. So I would like you to join me in welcoming our next panel. So we have with us today, so moderated by Maud Kessar from IRSEM, which is the Strategy Research Institute of École Militaire. And the speakers, we have Jim Bitterman from CNN, Guillaume Akka from Cyber Command, and Juliana Seuss from Rusi. The floor is yours. So you can give Juliana her name tag, unless you want to transition to being Juliana, that's fine.
Well, many thanks. So I'm Maud Kessler, and I'm very honored to chair this second panel dedicated to space, cyber, and information warfare. And more specifically, the question raised here would be, has the power of information warfare been underestimated in that particular conflict? So the purpose of this panel is to provide a first assessment of the impact of the war in Ukraine on information warfare, cyber threats and cyber resilience, and space war competition. So the panel will show how the current conflict reframe our perceptions of new power competition spaces, information, cyber, and space, because as was mentioned before in the introduction, we are attending a multi-domain conflict and a globalized one, and certainly the information warfare is a case in point when it comes to those matters. So we will listen to each of our panelists for 10 minutes, beginning with Jim Bitterman, then Guillaume Akka, and Juliana Seuss. Okay. So, Jim, the floor is yours. You're starting for 10 minutes, and I'll try to be very strict on time as well.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll try to be strict on time, but I may not succeed.
Yeah.
Thank you, Maud. So I'd like to just start off with a couple of numbers, if I could. There are, if you're to believe the people that should know these things, 4.5 billion internet users in the world, and the sheer quantity of published content is staggering. For example, in 1 minute, almost 42 million messages are exchanged on WhatsApp. 500 hours of videos are published on YouTube in 1 minute, and 500,000 comments appear on Facebook. From the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, two competing narratives have battled for credibility in the public space and on the internet. And judging from the leaders and nations lining up to support Kyiv and Moscow, it's probably not wrong to believe that the West version is winning the information war, but at the level of individual battles, it's not always clear which side is telling the absolute truth. What's more, many of those comments and messages are directed at us journalists. Every day, the CNN headquarters, just like at any news headquarters these days, is buried with stories, opinions, information, and misinformation from Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, YouTube, Telegram, and dozens more. The RAND Corporation calls this the fire hose of propaganda, describing the high volume of channels of information that have no reliance on truth. An increasing amount of journalists' time these days is spent to check the sources of things and determine the truth if we can. The war in the Ukraine has just added to the fog of war in a high-speed 21st century way. Generating that fog have been the obvious propaganda channels. Russia Today, for example, the state-owned news channel, spends $300 million to broadcast the Russian version of the truth in 5 Western and a number of Eastern languages. Despite sanctions, it is still broadcasting in a couple of Western countries which have been slow in sanctioning it. It was only in January of this year that it was definitively shut down in France, for example. Less obvious are the internet generators of mis and disinformation who are out there. The internet trolls, for example, who put out spurious information on social media platforms. According to one of these former Russian trolls, there are Russian trolls on duty 24 hours a day, each of whom has a quota of turning out 135 posted comments, at least 200 characters long. So they're putting out this misinformation and disinformation all the time. And then there are plenty of folks, Russian sympathizers, willing dupes, unknowing cooperators, happily spreading misinformation along with just about anyone who clicks share on their social pages without first checking to see if what they're sharing is the truth. The Russian propaganda efforts, characterized by high volume and a very multi-channel approach with rapid and continuous repetitive messages, and it lacks commitment to objective reality, and it shows no commitment to consistency. This is why have they chosen this method of operation? Well, research shows that to achieve success in disseminating propaganda, the variety of sources matters. Multiple sources are more persuasive than a single source, especially if those sources contain different arguments that point to the same conclusion. Receiving the same or similar message from multiple sources is more persuasive. People assume that information from multiple sources is likely to be based on different perspectives and are worth greater consideration. An endorsement by a large number of users boosts consumer trust. And when consumer interest is low, the persuasiveness of the message can depend more on the number of arguments rather than the quality of the arguments that are being presented. In other words, if you're not paying attention, you're more vulnerable to repeat messaging. Contemporary Russian propaganda is continuous and very responsive to events. Due to the lack of commitment to objective reality, Russian propagandists do not need to check their facts or verify their claims. Response speed is important because first impressions stick with people. Russian propaganda is also often targeted because of confirmation bias. If you know the beliefs that a person has, the propaganda can be tailored to a message that will suit their beliefs. So with all this misinformation and disinformation out there, how do we at CNN verify our stories? Well, to begin with, we have firsthand reports. On any given day of the war, we've had up to 120 people on the ground in the Ukraine and surrounding countries. Often they're in places where they can actually verify themselves the news. Secondly, we have open source intelligence. And here's something that's really interesting to talk about, and I'll get more on this in a minute, but it's been more available than ever before. Commercial satellite photos, for example, geolocation, the open source intelligence aggregator Intel Crab, the NASA active fire data, train and plane trackers are always open to anyone, including those organizations who can use these things to stand up or stand down information. More on it in a moment. If you're curious, we have a page on the CNN website with a video explaining how reports are checked. For example, we employ internet tools like reverse image search. Using reverse image search, we can determine when images were first used on the web. Something as simple as mirroring the image, flipping it around, may generate the indication that some video or photos are fake. Often there's metadata encrusted in the images, and that helps a lot. Then there's geolocation. Our researchers use Google Earth and other image libraries to create a panorama of images to enable them to spot identifiable structures in the surrounding area, which can be compared to the suspect photos or videos to make sure the location is correct. And once we are satisfied about the when and where the images come from, the accuracy of the stories involved is also brought to the fore. We run them past what we call the triad. We've got three peoples within our organization that are representing at all times. Deontology is any given story within the ethical limits of our organization. Editorial is the story worth reporting. Is it editorially significant? And legal, is it legal to report what we're reporting? So, I mentioned I'd have more to say about open source intelligence. According to the US Defense Intelligence Agency, about 80% of its intelligence today comes from open source intelligence. Where are all the spies? And what about my tax dollars? In any case, it's amazing how much information is out there and how many amateur detectives are willing to bring it to the fore. I mentioned Intel Crab. Intel Crab is run by a 20-year-old college student in Alabama who's never been to Ukraine, but probably knows more about what's going on there than most Americans. And the examples of open source intelligence are the stuff of legends. Jeffrey Lewis of California, using Google Maps road traffic reports, he identified a traffic jam on the Russian side of the border at 3:15 a.m. on February 24th last year. Someone's on the move, he tweeted, and less than 3 hours later, the invasion began. Open source intelligence analysts are now scouring Telegram, which is unmediated and has channels such as Rybar, which was founded by Putin's so-called chef, Yevgeny Prigozhin, to obtain images of the battle, testimony from the front line, and the mood of the troops. For military planners who'd like to maintain security, the amount of open source information is a nightmare. In 2019, before the war even began, after a series of mistakes, Russia passed a law banning soldiers from uploading sensitive photos or videos, but it's only been sporadically enforced. So, on VKontakte, which is the Russian equivalent of Facebook, there are plenty of geotagged pictures of the Russian soldiers and their bases available. This sloppiness can have deadly consequences. In December, for example, a Russian volunteer posted photos on VKontakte of forces encamped in a country club. His post included a geotag of the exact location. Ukrainian missiles struck it. The volunteer soldier then posted again afterwards, because he survived, and the Ukrainians had an after-action report of their strike. Inexplicably, the analysts say Russia has used basic off-the-shelf, unencrypted radio communications, in many cases that have made it relatively easy for Ukrainians and others to listen in. Russian troops began seizing cell phones from Ukrainian civilians, hoping to avoid detection from using their own cell phones. But Ukraine urged its citizens to report the cell phone number of the phones that were seized, and so the government could track and listen to what the Russians were saying. Again, it's a nightmare for any combat unit interested in operational security. So who's winning the propaganda war? I think we have to say at this point it's Ukraine. You have to start with this tireless President Zelensky. He's a performer. He has a social media presence. He stayed in the country, not hiding and unafraid to go to the front lines. Just hours ago, he was on the front lines near Bakhmut presenting medals to soldiers. He knows how to contact with the younger audience, and he lends credence to a great narrative of a plucky little country led by a plucky leader standing up to the big guy, a storyline that's hard to resist or even deny. With Putin, you get the image of a man alone. The long table, for example, he uses to greet and meet with foreign leaders and even his own cabinet. Only last week, for the first time since the war began, Putin was seen near the front line, and then it was at night. On the other hand, Ukrainian officials have treated the digital space as a front line in the war from the start, setting up teams and processes to verify the facts in all updates posted on their official channels as a way to preempt any challenges to their credibility. Ukraine's Minister of Digital Transformation says, in a way, we're trying to protect our brand as one of an honest nation and an honest people trying to tell the truth. Telegram has become the unfiltered and unedited war news and messaging site founded by two Russian brothers. It is now used by both sides in the conflict to spread their version of the truth. Through its private channels, for example, President Zelensky can broadcast his point of view on almost a daily basis. But it wasn't always that way. Telegram at first mirrored the information published by the Kremlin. But according to Olga Lautman, the US-based scholar, starting around September of last year, when Ukraine launched their successful offensive, everything started to fall apart. She says Russia lost control of the narrative, and it's normally relied on having a smooth propaganda machine, which no longer exists. Nonetheless, the Russians continue to use Telegram to create dozens of multilingual channels, like the one called War and Fakes, which verified or fact-checked allegations to support pro-Kremlin narratives and defend Russia's military actions. We at CNN keep an eye on Telegram because often it's the first with news items and video. But each story has got to be regarded with a great deal of skepticism until it's verified. But for most of its propaganda efforts, Russia has used some pretty traditional means to control information. State-owned radio and television channels, which not only aim to tell the Russian version of things, but also cast doubts on other sources of information, as well as casting doubt on any accounts of war reporting. But state control does not mean coverage is coherent. And analysts at Yale, for example, say that in many cases, Russian news itself will flip-flop between opposing narratives. During the war, for example, Ukrainians are presented as victims of the Ukrainian state, Nazis, or as a fake nation. Part of the problem is that the state-owned narrative, state-approved narrative is not always made clear to Russian journalists, and journalists cannot always be sure when they're following the party line or might be accused of breaking the law. Kremlin information operations often focus on essentially generating chaos, causing a loss of morale or just getting people simply confused. And sometimes it works. False allegations spread by the Kremlin that Ukraine was utilizing US-funded research labs to develop bioweapons were picked up by right-wing voices in the United States. So there's evidence that Russian propaganda could be counterproductive. Some Western officials, for example, and observers believe that the Russian President Putin may be locked in a world of false information served up by his intelligence agencies, which could lead him to escalate the conflict, not just against the Ukraine, but against the West in general. The Russian falsehoods and record of lies about the conflict also have given the Ukrainians little incentive to engage in serious dialogue with Russia. Said one of our CIA directors, we have had a great deal of effect in disrupting their tactics and their calculations and demonstrating to the entire world that this is a premeditated and unprovoked aggression built on a body of lies and false narratives. So this is one information war, the director said, that I think Putin is losing.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jim, for this very enlightening insights about the battle of narratives and the battle for hearts and minds. We will have questions after that, but before that we will question perhaps the resilience of the cyberspace after questioning the resilience of the information space. And Guillaume Aquin, you will, the floor is yours to deal with that question.
Thank you. So first, let me say that I don't speak on behalf of the French Cyber Command. The views are my own as someone who is working in the field. Obviously, because Ukraine is the first example of a war of high intensity where cyber is a true component, we look at it very closely and we think we can draw a lot of lessons from this war and how we integrate cyber to the rest of the components as well as space too. And so it generates lots of lessons identified. And also, bouncing off of what Jim said, we rely a lot on what you academics produce. It's of real value to us. You give us great insights to understand and put in context what happens, as well as OSINT as well, because this community of 20 and 30-year-olds are very effective at what they do, and we also look very closely. And it's I think it's a challenge for military organizations to integrate all these new sources of information. It can be very overwhelming, but it's also extremely enlightening. So I will make 3 points regarding the lessons learned and the retakes from Ukraine. First is the case of expectations versus reality in terms of cyber in Ukraine. Pre-war, the consensus, I think, was that the invasion would be accompanied by massive cyber attacks that would cripple the Ukrainian state and military, and maybe the defense would put up a good fight, but ultimately offense would win over defense. And it doesn't mean that the defense would be bad, it just means that for the last 10 years, we were seeing Russians operating in cyberspace. We were seeing the demonstration of their capabilities by their cyber criminal and state groups. And we were thinking it would be very difficult for Ukraine to survive that onslaught. And yet it did not materialize, but not because there were no cyber attacks, but rather because the impact was mitigated, because Ukraine received a lot of help from other countries, from private companies, because also Ukraine did a great job at bolstering its cyber capabilities. Since 2014, there was a great reinforcement and investment in fending off these Russian attacks. For example, I think it's in ISP Kyivstar. They increased the number of cyber experts by 2/3 roughly to be able to face the Russian attacks that they received. And because they were constantly under pressure from Russia, they gained, I think, experience and insight on how to defeat Russian cyber attacks. And going back to the help provided to Ukraine, I think the assistance of private companies especially has been invaluable, and it's really shift in paradigm that we need to integrate because truly you can build a coalition between public and private means, and Without these companies, I think it's fair to say that the Ukrainians would be in a much worse position than they are today. But at the same time, you can see that the tech people are not the same as the military-industrial complex people. So we have to build a new relationship with them in terms of how we can find ways to work together. And at the same time, there is also an issue of if ever there is a time when the Western world, for example, is involved in a symmetrical war against another adversary, is there a risk of cannibalization? If we have these companies helping the state, they would probably be under attack as well. So how do you deal with that, given the shortage of qualified people? So there is a lot to think about. And finally, a last possible explanation as to why cyber attacks against Ukraine were not maybe as effective as advertised, maybe lies in Russia, because they have a view of cyberspace which is different from ours, because for them cyberspace is an information space and for us it's a technical space. So they focus a lot on subversion when they implement cyber attacks, whereas we have a focus on technical effects, which means that our goals are not the same, which also means that our organization of cyber capabilities is not the same, because in Russia it's mainly the prerogative of intelligence services, whereas, for example, in France it's a military command, so it's not the same way. And also we know, even from open sources, that there were conflicts between FSB and GRU before the invasion, that Ukraine was the responsibility of the FSB, and then it switched after the invasion because GRU became in charge, since it was now a military operation. But then we can reasonably wonder if coordination was as good as it could have been, and if all possible cyber effects were implemented or not, and how much of that is due to internecine conflicts. A second point I want to make is, why is cyber warfare such a specific domain, military domain, and why is it difficult to integrate with other domains? And first, I think, when we talk about the Russian performance in Ukraine, if you have a hard time synchronizing your conventional effects, like ground with air or air with navy, it's likely that you will have a hard time, even harder time, synchronizing cyber with the rest of them. Because even for, I think, Western countries, in the relations that I have with other branches of the military on a day-to-day basis, I can see why it's a challenge to integrate cyber with everybody else. Because you can implement a cyber effect quickly, but it takes a long time to prepare. You have to identify how you're going to get into the system you want to attack. To build the right tool, you have to deploy it, and then you have to maintain your presence. And all of that is work that you have to do in the planning phase, because once the war breaks out, it's too late. This preparation time is not something you can get back. And so, as far as Russia is concerned, maybe the fact that the decision to invade was very secret maybe prevented them from building a military action plan that would encompass all domains and integrate cyber with the rest of the domains. And the other thing is that once you use malware or spyware and the adversary knows, then they will fix the vulnerability and your tool will become useless, or at least a lot less useful. It means that cyber tools have a short shelf life in general. And once you have depleted the arsenal, then you have little time to rebuild it. So in the span of a high-intensity conflict, you are going to have highs and lows in terms of use of cyber capabilities. So maybe we can say, why didn't Russia do better in terms of cyber in Ukraine? Maybe because they did it wrong, maybe because Ukraine was very good at defending, and also they got a lot of help. But it can also question what should be the place of cyber effects in the military toolbox, because they are challenging to implement in conjunction with conventional effects. They are specific in what they can achieve, they are non-lethal, they're usually reversible, and they tend to be kind of a one-shot weapon and very tailored to a particular target. So it doesn't mean that cyber is useless in symmetrical conflicts. It means that you need to play to the strengths of cyber and find what's the best possible use for this specific tool, which is so dissimilar to the rest of your conventional arsenal. And first, there's the question of timing. So cyber you will use before a military conflict to gather intelligence. You will be pre-positioned, and then you will be in a position to do something. And I think you have to use your cyber effects quickly at the beginning of a conflict, because once it begins, the adversary will monitor its networks better. They will reinforce security. And in fact, the Russians lost several pieces of malwares because they didn't use them. A good example is the malware in Destroyer 2, which would have affected the electrical grid of Ukraine. And they didn't trigger it as soon as the invasion began. And basically in March it was found out and it was neutralized because of the help that Ukraine got and their own efforts to clean their systems of Russian presence. And again, another point on timing is management of expectations, because you will have your conventional commanders pushing for cyber effects in support of their operations, but you won't be in a position to deliver them if you have not integrated them in the planning phase. So you need to anticipate the fact that cyber effects, as I said, will be high and low throughout the duration of the war, for the time for you to rebuild your cyber arsenal. Again, I think there is another point to take into account. It's cost-benefit analysis. Because a conventional weapon will render its target unoperational forever, and a cyber weapon might not do the same. So maybe you have to think of not whether I should use cyber instead of a bomb or a missile, but using cyber to reach targets you can't reach otherwise. For example, you have a target that is unreachable because it's in a third-party country. Well, then maybe cyber is the right tool for the job. Or you have a target you want to reach that would be too costly in terms of collateral damage. Then again, maybe cyber is the right tool for the job. But it's clear that in a conventional environment where the use of force is not a problem, then cyber is maybe less desirable than the conventional tools that we have. But it also means that cyber can be very well suited to facilitate other types of operations, and especially special operations, where you have a requirement for discretion, for low impact, and plausible deniability, which is much bigger than you have in a conventional conflict. So I think it's more of a case of finding the right spot for cyber in the military arsenal, instead of trying to force cyber into everything where it's maybe not the best tool. And I think also what we will see in the coming years is an increased digitization of the battlefield. And it's what we see in Ukraine. Every soldier has a smartphone, there is internet access everywhere. You have the Ukrainians using Android applications to facilitate targeting and information fusion, etc., etc. And this is likely, I think, to become more of a norm. Also because using these flexible platforms, you can, at a cheap cost, reinforce the capabilities of your military. For example, artillery targeting apps in Ukraine were developed by volunteers on Android. And in France or in the UK, in the US, we would have contracted a big company to do the same for millions and millions of euros or dollars. So you have an edge when doing this, but you also have risks, because then you can target these applications, these tools with cyber. So I think this type of conflict will be representative of what comes next. We will have battlefields where cyber could potentially reach any kind of weapon system, because all the new weapon systems, I mean, obviously you cannot hack a T-72 tank, but maybe you can hack a Leopard 2 or a Leclerc or any new machines that will come after that, because they rely also on connected communication systems, etc. So there will be more opportunities for cyber in the years to come. And it means that investing in cybersecurity and cyber defense is crucial. And it's, as James said, when you have people who are not trained, all the Russian newly mobilized soldiers that are getting to the battlefield and filming everything everywhere and posting everything to social media, they are a risk to themselves and their comrades and their units. And this is why cyber is not just about building shiny tools for the military to play with. It's also, like, I think it was a US responsible who said that, you know, offensive cyber, yeah, it's nice to have, but what you really need is defense, because it's enabling you to keep using what you already have and protecting you from being crippled by your adversary. But yeah, I'm sure we have the work cut out for us in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Guillaume, for sharing your insight and leading this advocacy speech for having issues different when it comes to cyber and perhaps opening the debate on the digitalization of the battlefield. But I'm sure that Juliana would complete with a complementary angle this idea of how to deal with connectivity and how does that occur in the space war and space competition. So the floor is yours.
Oh no. That was very subtle. I did that very well. Thank you. I think, can everyone hear me? Excellent. I see nodding in the last row. That's always a good sign. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm obviously thrilled that space forms a part of the panel on information warfare. I just want to highlight one thing when I start off, and that's the question of why does all of this actually matter in the context of Ukraine? And I think that's the sort of concept that binds all of this is that of information warfare, which has played a huge role in Russian military thinking over the last couple of years, by which you mean the holding of information as a really crucial aspect of, you know, conducting and winning a war, but at the same time also disrupting it for the adversary. Now, space plays a huge part in this, because space basically enables the flows of information. It does so in a defense context in three main ways, that is PNT, SATCOM, and ISR. So what does that mean in plain English? It's coordinates, it's communications, and it's imagery, and other sort of available information that you can gather from the air and from space. Now, information from space can be disrupted or can be spoofed, by which I mean was basically exchanging the real information with fake information, and we talked about mis and disinformation earlier as well. There have been a couple of examples of the denial of information access in Ukraine. And this started as early as 2014, right? So we saw the rerouting of internet via Russian service in the Donbass in 2014. We saw that again in Kherson in 2022. But also we saw this at the very beginning of the war, the morning of the invasion, in fact, when the satellite internet provider Viasat was hacked. And it was hacked to an extent that all user modems actually had to be sent back to the factory. They were essentially fried, they were toast. So, you know, an example where we see where a cyber attack actually has a physical impact on the hardware been handed out to customers. Why is this rerouting of internet specifically important? It's about the control of information, quite plainly, and the further dissemination of propaganda. So we see this not just in Ukraine, we also see this in Russia itself. So Russia is definitely trying to centralize control over its internet providers at home as well, therefore being able to control the information that reaches its citizens. Now you might say, well, there's been a really easy solution for this. We've had Starlink. That is right. It was a relatively quick solution. It wasn't as slick as it may seem. So actually the reason that Starlink was so readily and so quickly available in Ukraine was actually that SpaceX and Ukraine had been talking for several weeks before the outbreak of the war. And that was not because necessarily people anticipated the invasion. It was because, quite frankly, there's patches of rural areas in Ukraine that didn't have great connectivity to begin with. So actually this was meant to be a sort of patching of the network. But obviously Starlink has since been lent a whole nother relevance in Ukraine. But yeah, it wasn't a quick tweet, as it may look. That looked like a great sort of marketing situation. That it was not. And this has been especially important because a lot of the terrestrial infrastructure was targeted quite early on in the war. So we saw the example of Irpin, where every single cell tower was destroyed. We've further seen the sort of targeting of the electrical grid in Ukraine. Starlink managed to find a way around that, so now you can even sort of power your Starlink terminal with a car cigarette lighter. So some sort of very quick software updates that managed to get around some of the more tricky bits of actually getting Starlink up and alive for the Ukrainians. Now, why is the access to information so important? I think there's a civilian side and there's the military side. There was a really touching article written by an AP journalist, actually, who stayed in Mariupol until the city fell. And he said he never really understood why cities fall so quickly until he saw Mariupol. And it was about two things. There was chaos and it was impunity.
The immediate cutting off of information created so much chaos within the civilian population that the city fell quite quickly. And the impunity aspect is simply people didn't know what was going on. No word could get out to the rest of Ukraine or even the rest of the world. So Russian troops felt that they could act with a certain amount of impunity. And I think a really important aspect here is the communications with each other. And that's explaining which safety corridors are available. We've seen the Russian tactic of bombing safety corridors or alleged safety corridors for civilians. Information of where the troops are, where is safe, which parts of the city are safe, which parts have been bombed. But also at a very almost simple level, it's about who is safe, who of your friends, of your loved ones, of your family in Ukraine are alive and well. And I think that plays into the societal resilience aspect as well from a psychological level. But also, it's a very simple message of being able to project what's happening in Ukraine to the wider world, which I guess also plays into the impunity point, but also it's something that we've seen in Bucha in particular. And without independent access to information, I say that quite clearly, independent access to information rather than, disinformation or misinformation, these kind of things can spread really quickly, whether it's a malicious act of actually spreading propaganda in a war zone, or whether it's just the accidental misinformation of people just worrying and trying to help out. Now, from a military side, as we've seen with Starlink quite quickly, it's obviously enabled troops to communicate with each other on an individual level, but it's also allowed the flying and handling of UAVs to an extent. We've now seen, I'm sure you all have seen, the policy change that SpaceX has published to say, oh, this was never intended to be a military sort of capability, and we will now be restricting the use of UAVs through Starlink. How that will be technically possible, Starlink has not divulged that information. I've seen some reports of UAV groups that have said, oh yeah, we had trouble for around 2 to 3 days. It's back up and running. So I think the jury is still out on that one, to what extent that policy change actually had an impact. Now, we already talked about Butcher, and we already talked about open source intelligence. I think Jim mentioned this quite early on. Obviously, Starlink is not the only sort of element here. We've seen a lot of commercial satellite imagery that has really shed light on what's happening in Ukraine. I think we all remember the military traffic jam that accumulated outside Kiev last year. But we've also seen the atrocities in Butcher, which has allowed the West to say, we know exactly when Russian troops passed through the city. We know exactly what happened before and after, which might actually lead to Ukraine being the first ever conflict during which satellite imagery will be used in a court of law to prosecute those conducting crimes against humanity. Now, I've mentioned Starlink, I've mentioned commercial imagery like Maxar. Is this involvement of sort of space companies and commercial entities new in conflict? No, it's not. So, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US actually used commercial entities for 90% of their satellite bandwidth. But what is new is the extent to which they are being used, and specifically the extent in which commercial companies are now involved in the decisions. We've seen that with the sort of power that Elon Musk holds with Starlink, in the sense that if you look at a map of where Starlink is readily available, Crimea, no. It's the same, it's the map that you can see. Russia has a sort of dark blue shade because it's not available there. Crimea has the same. But also with the specific policy in terms of the usage of UAVs. So I think there's a couple of conclusions we can draw when it comes to space and cyber and misinformation, which is that space is useful, but it has its own restraints and its own vulnerabilities. The Viasat example that I mentioned at the very beginning in terms of a cyber attack is one, but I think it can go even further to the extent that we have seen, for example, in 2007, I think it was, someone hacked a ground station of a satellite and could have been potentially able to control the satellite as a result. So far, Starlink has proved relatively resilient in this, despite some jamming and some cyber hacking attempts. Elon Musk, again, this is a marketing thing perhaps, but he said they fixed it with a single line of code. But they actually did manage to fix it with a single line of code is debatable, but I actually don't think it really matters, because nonetheless, Starlink was back up and running within a couple of hours, and that's really what matters rather than the lines of code. So I think that is something incredibly impressive that we ought to look at. Now, we've seen a couple of statements specifically from Russia and China that have more or less subtly hinted at, well, we could just shoot down Starlink if we wanted to. Both Russia and China have kinetic capabilities that could bring down satellites. They've both tested them. China has certainly tested a lot of these, and Russia actually tested one in November 2021, which actually put their own cosmonauts on board the ISS at risk of being hit by pieces of debris. But we'll leave that at that. But I think that a kinetic attack against Starlink is actually incredibly unlikely. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one is mass. Starlink is a huge constellation of over 2,500 satellites. You would need to use a lot of missiles to actually, do any damage to the actual constellation, because these satellites, especially these mega constellations, they move around at all times. So even if one satellite is defunct or gets shot down, the constellation basically fixes itself by moving satellites around. So actually the sort of bandwidth wouldn't be affected unless you took down a whole salvo of satellites. Even if you were to do that, even if you were to send up dozens of anti-satellite missiles, which obviously success rate of that and the tracking and tracing of those satellites is a whole nother debate, but even if we were successful and you managed to sort of cause chaos in that orbit by bringing down a couple of those satellites and them in turn damaging other satellites, A, you would disrupt that orbit for yourself, and Russia has a space power and needs access to space itself. And secondly, I think the sort of catastrophic effect that they might be aiming for in this case would take so much time that it wouldn't really be operationally relevant. So that is why I don't think Starlink would be immediately at risk of a kinetic attack. Now, what can we sort of learn for the future? I think we can sort of assume, yes, the assumption that space will continue to be important is correct. I think especially if we're looking towards Taiwan, I think there's a couple of sort of takeaways here, specifically when we're looking at the vulnerability of communications networks. Taiwan is currently linked to the rest of the world via 14 undersea cables, which of course pose much more of a sort of kinetic potential target than satellites do, but they are looking at their own constellation. But they've also made the conscious decision of making it a sovereign constellation. So it would be a Taiwanese commercial entity, but it wouldn't be a government one, and it wouldn't be a sort of Starlink type led by a billionaire. So what we can see here is the reliance that these states really need, in terms of we need to be able to know that these communications networks are actually readily available to us as and when we need, and not just when someone decides that they will be available. But I think it will also show a further investment in the counter-space realm. So I think that's jamming, spoofing, cyber attacks, but also in terms of jamming of potential space-based ISR capabilities. So I'm thinking here potentially China looking more into the laser dazzling sort of business, in terms of we don't really want people to see exactly what is happening in Taiwan when and as, or if that might be the case. So I think the role of commercial has been really crucial in Ukraine, but I think it's also raised doubts about their reliance and to what extent we can trust these companies. So a little bit of a balance here in terms of, yes, we need it, and it adds sort of an additional resilience layer to any state, but also solely depending on them is equally dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Juliana, for explaining and making us aware of the limits of resilience when it comes to partnering with private actors, and which leads me to not open the floor yet, I'm afraid, but ask the first question to our three panelists. I would probably nuance some of what you said in terms of block of information. Perhaps could you try to explain to our audience here how we could perhaps see beyond the war in Ukraine and see how to tear down the walls of information for other audiences and populations that are not Western or Eastern, but rather in the global south that we mentioned earlier. That is to say that obviously the information warfare that is led right now is not only an issue for the Western or the Eastern Bloc, if we think in terms of the Cold War mindset, but it's also an issue for other theaters that are directly linked with our confrontation of our vision of blocks and our relation to Russia and China and revisionist power. So how would you...
Well, I just, on that particular issue, in fact, I took out a paragraph I had on that. the fact is that Russia particularly is targeting with its propaganda Latin American countries, African countries. I think you are seeing that. They're trying to convince the world. But I think, you know, I was just thinking about, when we're talking about the way that things operate these days, about how the Russians approach the Bakhmut is different from the Ukrainian approach to Bakhmut. The Ukrainians keep saying that this is really a difficult time and they're going to try to take it back and they're going to be, you know, in control and whatnot in Bakhmut. The Russians keep saying, well, we took Bakhmut, we had it, we've got it, here's our Russian soldier waving a flag. But, you know, what that does to their credibility is incredible because they haven't taken Bakhmut. President Zelensky was there this morning. And so the idea that somehow putting out false information is just going to work, it won't. It has to be credible. And, you know, I think increasingly people are now maybe not so much in the underdeveloped world or in places where they're not exposed to it so much, but maybe you'll have more traction. Maybe the Russians will have more traction with what they're directing at Africa and South America. But in the developed world, I think, you know, sophisticated listeners and viewers could kind of sort out things.
Okay, perhaps Guillaume or Juliana.
So I would like to agree with what you just said, but I can't, because I think the question of credibility depends on who you are talking to. And yes, Russian propaganda in Europe or North America has zero traction, and we've seen that, and we've taken, at least in the EU, strong measures against Russian propaganda outlets such as RT, Sputnik, etc. Okay, we did a good job in Europe, but how about the rest of the world? And when you look at Africa, for example, it pains me to say that what Russia says is taken more often than not at face value, at least by a lot of countries. And because what we say seems to be durably decredibilized, because every paper by a Western journal is immediately derided as an act of propaganda by France or the US, the UK, whoever. So I think the question is, how do we rebuild our own credibility? And so yeah, Mr. Mignot said in the introduction that influence was now considered another strategic domain for France, and it definitely is, but I think there is a lot of effort to be done outside of the scope of the military and in the, I think, investing in civil society. And I think the role of journalists, and I'm not just saying that because you're right next to me, Jim, is crucial, because we need to have people who act as intermediaries between the states and the people, and who can be regarded as trustworthy. And journalists have been attacked ruthlessly in the last decade or so, but I think they are the solution to this problem. It's giving the people access to sources of information that they can trust, and the states need to encourage that, but maybe we need to accept that we won't be believed all the time when we say things, and we will need to have our messages relayed and backed by others who are maybe more trustworthy. And I mean, when you look at influencers, for example, yes, they are maybe not all reliable, but for some segments of the population, especially maybe the younger generations, they are regarded sometimes as more trustworthy than the states because of the cognitive biases that you mentioned. So I think it's a question of how do we adapt to new media and new practices.
Well, I think, you know, a journalist would say we want to leave it up to the tech people to come up with algorithms that'll sort out the truth for us. Maybe that's the way.
It's amazing. That was exactly my point. It's time to open the floor for the Q&A session, and I'm sure that you have plenty of questions, and I already see someone in the back, so please, sir, could you introduce yourself briefly, perhaps, before we take the question?
Thank you very much. Is it work? No. No? Okay, good. Hi, my name is Adrian Canter. I'm an attorney at the Paris Bar, but I'm also a non-commissioner officer at the French Army. My first question would be for Mr. Aka, but Mr. Bitterman or Ms. Suez, if you want to answer, feel free. We've seen the increasing implication of private cybersecurity and dual-use companies within the war in Ukraine. How do you integrate these, such as polygons or also Starlink or Palantir? How do you integrate these companies within your scope of work, Mr. Aka? And can we see a similar pattern in on the Russian side? So how do we see such private companies involved in the war in Ukraine on the Russian side? I'm thinking of Kaspersky Lab, for example. Thank you very much.
I don't think I can respond to that very accurately, so I'm not going to. But you're saying basically what private companies that we can go to? I mean, I don't think we are a private company. You know, we don't. I don't think we want to rely on Fox News for our news, right? So you know, we generate our own news and we check our own news out, and you know, I can show you the app. We're all day long, constantly going back and forth to incorporate the news that's generated by our people in the field, but also the news. Like, for example, I mentioned the fact that we're looking at websites that tend to post things like Telegram and others that post things ahead of us and maybe give us a tip on a story or something, but we have to verify it all. We have to. So we are the private company that you're talking about.
Thank you for your question. So already there are programs that exist within the Western militaries. For example, in the US, Amazon and Microsoft are working with the US Defense, and in Europe we have Airbus that has a cybersecurity division. We have Thales. We have a lot of great companies that provide technical services to the state and to the militaries. I think the challenge maybe is how we integrate smaller companies, because it's always, I think, a challenge for them to work with the state, although this is a procurement issue, and I think we are trying to invent a new relationship with the tech sector, and I think that's the main point. The war in Ukraine showed how much they could bring beyond the scope of what we thought before, because it's not just about building you a new cloud infrastructure, it's about much more than that. It's about saving your government's data, it's about making it accessible, it's about a lot more than what we thought. So I don't really have an answer right now as to how this is how we do it. I think it's challenging us to invent this new relationship. And as far as Russia is concerned, so I don't know specifically about Kaspersky, but what I do know is that Russia has made a huge push to develop sovereign solutions for its military. They have invested in their own operating systems, both on PC, derived of Linux, and on Android. There was a Finnish company that was building a piece of OS for Android, and they kind of repurposed it for mobile terminals. So they are definitely trying to wean themselves off of Western tech solutions. But like everything else in Russia, you also have to see it as, you know, the military-industrial complex, and I will integrate tech companies to that, is also a way to reward people, to give them a piece of the cake, to enrich them, to give them money, etc. And this affects the efficacy with which things are done. And it's true as well for tech companies in Russia. Also, you have to take into account the massive exodus of tech people out of Russia since the invasion began. The numbers I've seen range from 50 to 100, maybe 150,000 people from IT in Russia who have left. And I think Russia, like all of us, didn't have enough of these people in the first place. Now they have less than what they need. And these people, I think, are unlikely to come back because they can work from anywhere and they can make more money than they did in Russia. So they will have a big challenge on their hands. And there is also the question of components. I think which will be touched maybe in the next panel, but it's not just about software, it's about hardware too.
Yes, sir. So could we have a mic perhaps in the back for 2 questions? Okay, first.
Go by age.
Okay, go by age.
Hi,
Difficult to assess, actually.
sorry. Hi, my name is Sanjay. I'm from Queen Mary University of London in Paris, and I want to thank you all for your thoughts. I just have two really quick questions. The first is, so one common theme across all your speeches was the role of youth and the younger generation playing a role in accessing and producing information from open sources and their role in operationalizing cyber attacks. So how do you think Europe, or France in particular, can identify young talents across the country to help contribute to this aspect of the war? And my second question is, where do you see the evolution of artificial intelligence technology during wartime? Do you think the war is going to accelerate the development of artificial intelligence technology, or do you think the increased dependence on traditional warfare might actually delay or slow down the development of AI? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Guillaume, I think that's a question for you.
Sure. So, and I'm not just saying that to advocate for my own parish, but the Cyber Command has a reserve program. You actually have two programs. You have operational reserves, which give you a military status, and you have the citizens' reserves, which we're trying to bolster currently. So this is an obvious way for the youth to be more involved in cyber defense. But to be fair to my colleagues from other ministries, the Ministry of the Interior also has such programs, especially Gendarmerie Nationale. So you have a bunch of options. But I believe that being involved as part of the civil society is equally as important. You have a lot of NGOs doing great work. You have all the people in OSINT, and you have, for example, a Discord channel, it's called OSINT FR, gathering a lot of really great people in France doing OSINT and sharing tips and sharing tools. And I think this involvement is just as valuable. It's coming back to what I said before. We are not going to have, with the tech sector, the same, and when I say we, I mean the military, we're not going to have the same relationship with the tech sector as we have with industrial partners who are part of the military-industrial complex. And I think it's a comment that I've heard from military chiefs talking about their younger IT staff. You know, the people who are never on time, always a bit grungy looking with beards and everything. You have to accept that every new domain has its specificities, and you need to, instead of trying to force the square into the round hole, well, you have to work around that. So I think all involvement is welcome, but if people want to join the reserves, it's more than fine with us. And as part of the second question, I'm not knowledgeable enough about AI to really answer the question, but I think AI has so many applications in industrial and economic and medical domains that I'm not seeing the war having such an impact on it. But definitely, I think the war in Ukraine shows that it's great to have technological tools and weapons. It's great to have cyber, but you cannot afford to not have conventional weapons, and you need to have lots of them. And I think this is a lesson we are relearning, that you can't rely on just a few of shiny toys. You need to have a lot of not so shiny toys.
Okay, thank you so much. One last question, please.
Well, thank you very much for the interview. Was wondering about space. Space always have been, since the detent during the Cold War, a sacred field of cooperation, even with the annexation of Crimea, and we see still cooperation with the ISS since the beginning of the war. And so my question is, do you envision that such cooperation will continue, or will it eventually, because there have been war crimes and more, will it eventually be ended? Or in the next 10 years, how will it go, knowing that eventually also at one point the ISS will need to be replaced?
That's a great question, and it's a space question as well, so thank you. So it's really interesting how the Russian messaging towards the ISS has changed. So can you hear me, by the way? Yeah, I think so. So at the very beginning of the war, obviously the director of Roscosmos was Rogozin, and we saw some really harsh messaging about we will let the ISS drop down to Earth, blah, blah, and it will definitely land on American territory, etc. By the way, physically, different question, Mr. Rogozin, but there we are. And it was really interesting because obviously the ISS, the whole purpose of it being there and the way that it's conducted, it's meant to only work through cooperation. So that's all the way down from the technical aspects, whereby it's the Western element that has all the electricity, and it's the Russian segment of the ISS that has the propulsion systems, actually the ones that sort of maneuver the ISS in case it needs to dodge a piece of debris or because of gravitational pull. So, but all the way down to the people as well who are working together in their respective centres, and who visit each other for training and language lessons, etc. So you're right, the ISS will be decommissioned around 2030, we think. There's nothing really in place that will replace it as such, unless sort of a commercial company sort of picks this up relatively quickly. We don't really have a replacement in mind. And I think it's really interesting for Russia, because the question is, where would they go? Obviously, they were the first nation to be in space, the first to also launch a human into space, but they might actually be left out in the cold, because the only other partner would be China, for example, through Tiangong. But quite frankly, China doesn't really need Russia in this cooperation. They've got their space station already up, whereas with the ISS, Russia was an integral partner to this. It would not be with China. It would be the sort of junior partner in this, and I'm not really sure that's desirable for Russia, who obviously also use their spaceflight program and the history of it as a sort of prestige project. So the messaging has, since Rogozin left, really calmed down, and there's definitely some sort of damage control happening within Roscosmos at the moment. So now they've just said, we will end the partnership sometime after 2026, which they will have to anyway, because it won't be there after 2030. So it's deliberately vague to say, we can't completely sort of get rid of what Rogozin said, but, we're willing to cooperate as long as it takes. So it'll depend sort of when the ISS will actually go, but I think Russia will stick with it until sort of the ISS actually physically gives out.
Okay. Thank you so much, Juliana. I'm afraid it is time to thank our three panelists for this very fruitful discussion, and it's time for break as well. So thank you so much, the three of you.